update on this, on where we're at, and then we'll go into that exercise. But we're ready whenever you are.
I'm ready. We'll call the meeting order and turn over to Kyle. Have to give a speech first or something.
All right, I can start with that hybrid instructions. Sure. Thank you everyone for attending our LDC update steering committee meeting. Before we begin, because this is a hybrid meeting, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. The meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and on cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you're not speaking. The chat function for this meeting is disabled and all chats will go directly to the Zoom facilitator. Unless you are participating during the meeting, please turn your video off. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting. And when you are participating, please turn your video on. And if you have any trouble with that, you can send a chat to the Zoom facilitator. Finally, the city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. So with that, I'll turn the meeting back over to the chair.
Thank you very much. And I think Elizabeth is going to give us the kickoff, some updates, and then we'll move into our project for the day. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining the steering committee meeting tonight, this evening, this afternoon. Wanted to give you a few updates. We wanted to let you know that we are just about done drafting module 1, the zone districts and uses, and we'll be handing that off to staff to take a look at and give us their thoughts. We'll give them a few weeks to do that. We will make their revisions and turn the draft around to you guys by sometime in mid to late April. I think that there may be some people joining the meeting tonight that thought we would be going through that module, but we are instead doing a dry run of a community outreach activity. And so we encourage everyone that wants to be included in the discussion about zone districts and uses to rejoin us for the April steering committee meeting when we'll be talking about that. So that's the schedule update. I we have in the agenda, we wanted to see if anyone has any additional topics that the committee needs to discuss before we jump in to sort of gauging the activity that we're looking at tonight.
I had a quick question. So as staff is going through and reviewing the first draft of part 1, is there going to be track changes, comments, kind of a register of stuff that staff had looked at so the committee can also see what that looks like?
So we don't typically track changes between our draft and the staff draft because the point of that is to make sure that we have not made egregious errors or not heading the code off in the wrong direction. Typically, we don't have a ton of disagreements between the consultant and staff, so you won't be missing anything in there. We start redlining once we get that, or tracking changes once we get that first version out. And so we'll share a version with you guys and a version with the community, and then that will be the set baseline for future discussions, and we'll show tracked changes on top of that.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, so if staff does make any changes between what you submit to them and then what you submit to us, we're not going to see them?
No.
So I guess my concern is from a transparency standpoint, you mentioned if for some reason you may guess the wrong direction. That was one of the examples that was listed. Since we are the steering committee, direction and steering seems kind of tightly related. So I would be interested to see if there's any direction that is changing sort of without the steering committee's knowledge. I'm not saying that's going to happen. It's just, it'd be nice to kind of know, right? And if I'm talking too loud, I don't know how much I need to project, by the way.
Right. So I think it's an extra level of complexity that we don't need to introduce at this point in the project. You guys will see it as a clean slate and you can steer it in whatever direction that the committee thinks we need to go to.
Yeah, my theory is that we're going to be steering it, so steer away.
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of seems odd that there's a whole set of revisions that we're not ever going to see. That, I mean, if it's stuff that is of a subjective nature, I think it'd be good to run that by the steering committee. If there's something that's like factually incorrect, like we're going to get rid of R6 zoning, like that doesn't exist. Okay, sure.
Yeah.
But if there's something that's like, we're gonna, strike ADUs from the ordinance entirely, which is obviously a complete hypothetical, but it'd be good to know if that never saw the light of day before we see it.
I can add, Jeff, if you have big concerns with it, will you tell us at the next meeting? As opposed to tracking changes, that's my
Yeah,
concern, is
I'll
the
track.
track changes, so. The last one was hard enough just to see everyone's track changes, but
Yeah, it'd be our intent to bring it for that discussion. You are the steering committee. We want you to have that direction and give us that guidance to go forward on.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, the same to you. If there's big disagreements between you and staff, you'll help bring that to our attention so we can talk about that as we do our discussion.
We will flag it. We will note it to you in the transmittal memo and in a footnote. How about that?
Sounds good.
That's very good. Thanks a lot. Sorry, as a consultant who often gets extra work from his clients, I usually go very hesitantly towards that, but I do feel like it would be very instructive for us to see those. So thank you.
Hello, comments or questions before we head to the meeting in the box? Elizabeth, you going to kick that off and give us the background of this?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so while we're getting ready to steer the code, we have put together this community character meeting in a box. And so the intent of a meeting in a box is that members of the community, either as individuals or groups, can do this activity to provide us some information or some guidance about how different parts of Lawrence see themselves. And what we're trying to get at with this activity is to figure out if we're tailoring some aspects of the regulations, if that's the zone districts, if it's the uses, if it's the design standards. We want to know what different parts of the city prioritize, and then we want to see if we can find any patterns across that. Our goal is not to draft a mini set of regulations for each neighborhood, but it is to see if there are similar trends and priorities across different swaths of the city. And if we, see some aspect as consistently important, to make sure that we're reflecting that in the regulations. So we could take street trees as an idea of that. Some neighborhoods love street trees, some neighborhoods are really neutral about them, some don't care for them. And so we've put a series of concepts and ideas in here to gather that feedback about. We will allow anyone who's interested in doing it to either download it from the website or get a hard copy from the city. Or we will also post an interactive version on the website. So if we have people who want to do it individually, they're invited to do it. You don't have to do it in a group. We're trying to make it as kind of universally available as we can. And so what we're asking you guys to do tonight is to go through the packet, and take a look at it, read the instructions, do the activity for the neighborhood that you live in. I think that's where we ended up. And then we're looking for a couple things from you. We're looking for comments about where something in the package you think could be clarified or could be explained differently. So like that meta analysis of it before it goes public. It makes more sense to us in this way. And then we're also looking to see how you might have responded to stuff. And if you have, responses that you want to share with us, so we can make sure that the answers coming in are going to line up with the questions that we've put out there. So this is the first time that we as Clarion have done this activity. And so that's part of the reason why we're trying to do this dry run with you. We want to see sort of what input we get before we put it out there and catch any errors that might, cause people to, not participate the way that we think that they could participate. So that's it. There are no right and wrong answers on your part. What we're really looking for is your feedback or your response to the instructions, to the characteristics and qualities. We do want to have a conversation about a few follow-up questions that are identified in the agenda for this evening. So what instructions were unclear, what questions were unclear. We are struggling on our end with the neighborhood identification. Are we doing it too narrow by asking for individual neighborhoods? Should we pull out and ask for some sort of different geographic measurement across the community? And then are there other questions or is there other information that you think would be helpful? So should we add a glossary to it? We tried to describe everything in place, but if you found that you need a little more information. And then also, if you wanted to say something else, we're curious about that. We're trying to keep it.
Breaking up some here.
Sorry?
You're breaking up. We're missing.
Does that help?
It
Hold on.
might be the internet in the building too.
Okay, how's that?
Continue. We got most of what you said, so.
Okay. So, and then finally, we want to know if there was anything else, information that you wanted to provide that we didn't ask for. We are trying to keep this to about an hour. That may be wishful thinking. So that's the other thing we want to look at. Is there anything we want to take out? But apart from that, I think our chairperson is going to moderate issues of what are we doing and what aren't we doing. And Gabby and Brody and Becky and Jeff and Kyle and I can't see who else is there, can answer specific questions. But otherwise, kind of do it, critique away, let us know what you think. If you have thoughts about any groups or individuals that we should reach out to start sharing this when it's ready to go. This is part of inviting the community into the project. Questions, comments? I see you're reading.
I think
Carry on.
that's good. We had used the media in the box sort of idea with the strategic plan and had a lot of success with it. And taking it to small groups and neighborhood groups and, Rotary groups and PEO groups and book clubs and all of that, so we're trying to get this idea out there to get some sense from the community. And again, so this is all new on that end, but so one, start taking a look at that so we can give some feedback. What I'm going to do is, we'll have each of us kind of, ask the question and maybe 2 or 3 people can answer the question from their neighborhood point of view. I mean, typically, maybe when this is done, it could be a neighborhood group, so they're only thinking about the neighborhood, but it could be a book club who each are answering it from their own point of view and filling out the document, but having a discussion about that. But again, as Elizabeth said, we want to make sure the questions are getting the answers, getting the types of responses we want, that the answers are clear, that sort of thing. So we won't all have to answer each one of these questions. And certainly for time's sake, we won't do that. But then at the end of that, we'll come back and then we'll have a discussion. Hey, these characteristics and qualities, are we missing any? Are they good? And then all the questions get into the areas we want. So that sound right, Elizabeth?
Sounds wonderful. Should we time it? Or do you guys want to just go, because we're going to kind of do some back and forth, do we want to just take the meeting to do what we need to do?
Yeah, I don't know if we need to time it, because we'll probably do it a little differently than you do it actually. But I guess, I would start with number 1. I mean, as people look at that, 1, do you all recognize your neighborhood? Or are we missing neighborhood?
Yes. I think this is the best you can do, given the city database on what it's do self-identify. I don't know how any more details.
Yeah.
No, I think you're missing Southern Parkway on the list. You might want to expand the size of the map because there are quite a few neighborhoods that don't have their names on the map.
Well, Southern Parkway is on the list, but
Huh?
Southern Parkway is on this list.
So.
It's on that list, but not on the map.
Oh,
I see.
Yeah, it is.
You're looking at the map.
No,
Right next
people that don't know
They're
where they actually are.
above Meadows Place,
On there.
I
lower.
think
Yeah, it's there.
the yellow
On the
box
spring
on the
heights.
top, but we need to move the label into it.
I would just suggest expand the size of the map.
Yeah.
Just so you can, because there are a lot of people that don't actually know they're in a neighborhood association until they see a map. And just get the name on it.
But it'd be interesting to have an additional option, say, I don't know.
That's on there.
Yeah.
I have rather not say. I don't,
But I don't know is different.
that's a,
Yeah.
too.
One is privacy, one's ignorance, right? So,
Yeah. People always like to say that.
Yeah.
Brad, how does this relate to greenfield development, annexation?
There could be students indoors.
I'm not sure that it does, but we can ask that to Elizabeth.
So this is actually addressing just one component of our development code. I'm curious about how this is going to infiltrate on new annexed areas.
How will this impact new annexed areas? It's like, are we asking them to be included in doing this exercise, or how will standards when we draft them apply?
How the draft will apply. I mean, how will the information that we populate from this exercise apply to newly annexed areas? I mean, what pieces of the code that, will the information that comes from this, I'm looking for, actually, I'm just looking for relevance. Okay, so this is this an exercise that's going to help us with infill development in these in various neighborhoods throughout the town? And has nothing to do with when we're annexing new pieces of ground into Lawrence?
No, it should, if we did it right, it should apply in town, it should apply to infill, it should apply to infill suburban to the extent that that's a thing, and it should apply to annexation once it's in its final zone district. So when we set the standards, let's say that we decide that there are a series of connectivity standards or lighting standards that are more new development or new rural to urban transition development in nature. That's part of what we're trying to pull out of this. So if we stick with lighting as our standard, do we have lighting that's applicable in areas that are more dense and more closely developed, and different lighting standards for areas that might be more sparsely developed? And that might be what happens in annexation, or it might get rezoned to something that is more suburban or more urban, and then the standards would apply that way as it built out. Does that help answer the question?
Sort of. So the people identified here as West Lawrence and their answers and their responses and how that is applied to that kind of development then would naturally be applied to, if we ever jump the traffic way on west of there, then whatever we've determined from this West Lawrence beating in a box then can not necessarily get applied to the new developments on the other side. Is that a fair?
If that's the development pattern, that if we come up with a West Lawrence development pattern that represents something that is common across the city or common enough in West Lawrence, and that's how we think development's going to go as it expands that way, then yeah, it would be similar lighting standards, similar parking standards, similar access standards, could be similar design standards for commercial development. So yeah, that is trying to pick up on what's key to the patterns now across development standards like that, and come up with a set of maybe 3 or 4 that link roughly to a series of zone districts.
So is it fair to say you're looking for commonalities between people that identify with their individual neighborhoods, what could apply citywide, or what exists or what might come, as well as looking for what types of differences there are from the different characteristics in the areas? So give us a range of possibilities.
That's correct.
Try to get into the code.
Yeah, exactly. We're looking to put a range in the code. We're looking for this information to help us sort of suss out in the preliminary concepts. What we're going to bring back to you guys will reflect the city's priorities and preferences, but also best practices. It won't just be what we get from individual neighborhoods or individual community members, but that's going to inform where we start looking for best practices and development standards at a scale that will work in different ways in Lawrence.
Questions on that?
Do we want any comments on what neighborhood you live in? Oread residence is not different really from the Oread neighborhood. It's just that there's an Oread Residents Association because the Oread landlords kicked us out.
So that's probably the same. That should be.
That should be the same. And I like the idea of having a KU district because there are kids who live in dorms. And I'd love to have people, especially if they're involved in a planning class or an architecture class, fill this out and feel like they have a neighborhood.
Yeah, I'd also suggest if we add KU, we also add Haskell as part of that, so that.
That's great. Yes.
A small cluster down there, but it is a distinct area in how it's put together.
Again, we'll circle around to all big picture questions, but anyone else have anything neighborhoods at the moment? Okay, so the first question is using the neighborhood and area characteristic and qualities. Use the top 3 or 5 options that you think make your neighborhood unique, or your neighborhood unique or a great place to live, and describe why. So I'll take a couple volunteers. We won't all answer all of these, but a couple people volunteer to answer that question. Who wants to go?
I'll say that alleys are very important to our neighborhood and I think the title would be better if it says location of garages, parking access, alleys, to actually name that in the title, because you have to kind of read to say, do you access your garage or off the alley? But alleys are, the neighborhoods that have alleys are very different from the neighborhoods that don't.
Okay, give us 3 or 5 though. You started now. You only gave us 1. You have
Okay.
2 more. What do you think makes?
And I don't know if it's on here, the shape of the lot, that the lots in our Oread neighborhood tend to be more narrow and deep rather than wide and shallow. And that actually is very important in terms of building patterns in our neighborhood. And
It's a
then,
little bit like building separation. The houses are closer together and.
no, because it's not how close the houses are together. It's that it's long and thin lots.
Okay.
And then I would also say demographic mix, just the idea that we have students and people who've lived in the neighborhood for years, sort of mixed together in a very interesting way.
And that's for the Oread neighborhood, not
That's for the Oread neighborhood.
those who might not know.
So that's my three.
Okay, thank you. Someone else answer for their neighborhood. Maybe someone lives out west or someone who, what makes your neighborhood unique or great? You know, someone an answer from different.
I'll jump in. I'm not out west, but so I am in the Schwegler neighborhood.
Okay.
The ones that kind of stand out to me, consistent architectural style era. There's a lot of sort of 1950s, 60s ranch sort of developments, very not entirely consistent, but pretty consistent throughout that whole neighborhood. Sidewalks and street trees. I don't know that street trees is really applicable because it's just a lot of more older trees at this point. There's a lot of tree cover. Sidewalks. There's a lot of people be out walking or walking dogs. Very, it's a family friendly kind of neighborhood. There's a lot of out riding bikes and a lot of activity that way. What other ones stand out? Maybe demographic mix. There's a pretty mix of single family, like owner occupied and rentals in that neighborhood. So there's a fair amount of occupants in there. Particularly with campus growing to the south. So I think those would be my three for Schwegler.
I would one more post on that one, then we'll move to the next one. So if you want to say something about your neighborhood the other way, that'd be good. One more post on that one, anyone?
Where do these people live?
What?
Where do these?
Okay, I'll let someone,
West side.
okay, I'll let. Next question, some of you are gonna have to answer, so I'll answer this one. I live in the Hilton District. Oh, you gonna do it?
No, I was just gonna say, before we go on, do we want to pause for any comments or questions about the question itself? Or do we want to wait till the end? of That,
Yeah, one right now, you can throw it up.
okay. The only thing was that I noted it was an interesting choice of wording that it says, what do you think makes your neighborhood unique or a great place to live? Indicating that unique isn't necessarily a good thing, right? Like it can be uniquely bad too. So I'll be curious to see how many folks answer in that way instead, because for the most part, we've been talking about positive neighborhoods and why we like the more kind of neutral things. But it'd be interesting if somebody says like, well, you know, it has a uniquely bad amount of traffic, for example. So I thought I don't know how many people are going to pick up on that, but it's cool that it's there.
I'll also say that some of these are fairly narrow in the description, like, for example, proximity shopping and other services. I live in West Lawrence, live Nicholas and Inverness. And I love that I can go a half a mile to the north and I can go up within a very short drive, a bike ride, but it doesn't fit that description. I would write that down, proximity shopping and other services, if not for the quarter mile. It only counts if you can walk it limitation. There's a couple of other descriptions in there that are limited and to word walkable. But there's attributes in neighborhoods that are positive, don't necessarily fit that narrow description.
Would we, if we took out the walkability, would we just say close by? We like that it doesn't matter how you get there, but you like that it is nearby.
And whatever your method of getting there, that it have that inside your neighborhood, which could be part of your neighborhood. I suggest considering that anyway.
Because I'm wondering if from the Schwegler neighborhood comment about family-friendly bikes and connectivity, if we pull out a category of mobility and then move away from walkability and some of the other stuff.
Is a bicycle a vehicle?
If it has, if it's electric powered, it is, or can be.
You want to understand the character of that neighborhood, to try to get at things that we find to be desirable, advantageous. If it's limited in this way.
Oh, no, I think that's right. But I'm sort of saying it says without a vehicle and I'm going, bicycles are a really good way to get around a lot of neighborhoods and may not necessarily fit this. So going up 9th Street, probably not. But there's neighborhoods where a bike is a great way to get around.
Would it be fair to maybe call it accessibility instead, because different neighborhoods view accessibility in different ways? Like a 5-minute car trip is nothing, or a 5-minute walk is nothing, right? So both are equally accessible depending on how you,
I like that.
what people's lifestyles are. But then we could add walkability on top of that, which is sort of what could be extracted from some of these other ones. I guess.
Maybe not remove the word walkability, but add another word that,
Mhm.
that, you know, both.
Well, a neighborhood's walkable, but not necessarily walkable to shopping.
Right. There's a difference between a place that is technically walkable and one that you're actually going to walk in. So that makes a difference too. I don't really know how you can say mixed use. I think that's what this one is trying to go for. Like, do you have a relatively mixed use 15-minute city kind of neighborhood? Which I think would maybe preclude your suggestion of
Well,
cars.
I'm
So
trying to get at mixed use, let's say mixed use.
Hmm.
Right? Because proximity to shopping and other services is I feel like I have great access to shopping, but it's just doesn't meet that narrow definition.
Mhm. Yeah. It is tricky to equally apply that to across the city.
Maybe they're two separate things.
Are these characteristics and qualities that are shown on these 2 pages, are they standard for the industry in terms of what's utilized for these types of exercises?
It's an Elizabeth question, I think.
So we weren't able to find a standard for the industry for this particular exercise. A lot of the things that are used when we are looking at character, it's more often done in the form of a visual preference survey, which wasn't necessarily what we wanted to do here because we wanted the neighborhoods or areas to be self-described. But if you look across this list of characteristics, this is typically stuff that a visual preference survey would be testing for. So it is unique to Lawrence, but it is definitely crossing categories that you would use to describe character.
Thank you.
Well, again, we'll circle around to some of this in the whole picture here. I think if we answer some of these other questions, it also might make us think about these characteristics and qualities a little more thoroughly, and then maybe come back and talk about those. From the same list, now choose top 3 or 5 options that you think could be improved or that you would like to see in the future in your neighborhood, and describe why. Who wants to answer that? Jump in there.
Relatively new to my neighborhood, so I feel like this is a bit traitorous.
Oh my God.
Definitely things being.
Pick a different neighborhood then. No one knows where you live.
I know where he lives.
Well,
I already got it.
Pick the Orion neighborhood, pick on it.
I mean, honestly, I'd probably have the same quibbles for all the neighborhoods, but, all right, so I live in East Lawrence, used to live in Pinckney, and they're relatively similar in terms of like when they were built and how they're built out. So I think these probably apply both. I listed building separation, housing types, and building setbacks. So I went the full wonky like zoning land use route. Because I think the defining infrastructure was number 4, didn't quite make it, but decent. It's fine.
Explain each of those just a little bit more, why you picked each one.
Building separation, I feel like, given that we're right near downtown, which is sort of the most dense and walkable part of the city, it seems like a rather odd transition to suddenly go into mostly single family residential with like, one road in between, right? It seems like there would be, even if we stayed completely single family residential, which it's not already, but squeezing things together a little bit is actually historically accurate. And a lot of the oldest buildings in East Lawrence are really quite close together. But the new ones aren't because they're built to the modern zoning code. Listed housing types because, like I mentioned, it is relatively, it is in an urban area. And I think a lot of people from Kansas will call it urban, but it's still mostly single family homes. There's a couple of odd apartments that are kind of hiding in there, a couple of duplexes. I live in co-housing. So like there is a diversity of housing, but not nearly as much as could be given the diversity of people. And then building setbacks, which is purely a dimensional thing, but it's kind of like building separation in that we could probably squeeze things a little bit closer together. We don't really need 30-foot setbacks in the historic neighborhoods, especially if people don't really want the front yard or have the capability of maintaining one. So that's what I put down. I thought it was interesting that some of these could be the same as question one. If there are things that are unique and you also don't really want them to stay the same. So good wording choice again.
Politically speaking, here's one thing that's not on the list, neighborhood schools. So
Right.
I think, is there a school that you feel because there's some neighborhoods that are absolutely defined by their school and others that are not. So I think that's probably an important.
One that actually has the same name as theirs.
That's a couple.
Well, two.
Right.
I did have a question about that. I wondered, was thinking about that yesterday, if the infrastructure category should maybe expand to like a defining characteristic. So it could be a school, could be your park, it could be that you have the railroad tracks next to you, but we could broaden out that particular category to capture that thing that is critical to your view of yourself.
Would the school be infrastructure or do we need to come up with a different name?
Well, it's currently defined as, I mean, it says infrastructure, but it's only transportation infrastructure in here. So that would kind of change that category. But in terms of shopping and other services, it's not currently explicitly listed, but that would make a lot of sense. And like, are you closely accessible to a school? And if you feel that it defines it because it's a historic school, I think that would be covered under the historic resources section. That's just my personal opinion.
I think we would change the category title on defining infrastructure. So because if you could figure out 3 different ways to interpret it, we would get it interpreted 3 different ways. So I'd actually want to be clear and change that out from just transportation infrastructure to add in parks and schools and anything else that we think is kind of a neighborhood defining attribute.
But I think what Nick was saying is maybe makes more sense with shopping and other services. That are you by a school? Are you by the public library? Are you by a park? What's the thing that you're close to? You know, in our neighborhood, it used to be the community mercantile until they moved back up the hill. But, you know, so what is that thing that you're living close to that?
Both good and bad.
Yeah.
Sounds like it's almost its own standalone category. Like, is there a thing that your neighborhood is known for, you know?
I like the defining, but instead of defining infrastructure, I kind of like it there. Yeah. I guess I lean towards Elizabeth. Instead of calling it a defining infrastructure, call it a defining something, I don't know what the word is.
Or even like signature or something.
Yeah, signature, something like that.
Yeah. Because that could include like the Lawrence Loop, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
It's transportation, but it is also a kind of defining
Yeah,
feature.
so if it's a school, if it's a thing, I think that's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, back to your point, Nick, you know, I live in Hillcrest neighborhood. Now I live on the north side of the Hillcrest neighborhood. So our defining infrastructure is that there's only 2 ways in and out. There's no sidewalks, and so there's very little traffic, and which makes us unique, but also sometimes good, except when you're trying to leave in the morning, you know, in the afternoon. So I could see myself listening at both in 2 and 3.
Yeah.
As a problem, but also a unique characteristic. Okay, anyone else want to pick up? Again, I'm thinking about this question, but you know, how people might answer this. How you think your neighborhood can be improved, or what you'd like to see in the future in your neighborhood? You know, I think those are really 2 different things, but let's be pretty wide open. I mean, what would you like to see in your neighborhood? Doesn't necessarily mean, you know, so I like that, but anyone else want to answer that question? Being quiet here, Derek. The calling people.
Have I been quiet? I don't think so.
Ever since the meeting was called to order.
That's right. Okay, I'll go to 4, and then I want to come back and I've asked the question, why are people having trouble? Why aren't we having more people jumping in on this? I thought it'd be easy, but everyone would jump in. And I'm curious, I'm gonna come back and ask that question. Why aren't people immediately jumping in and answering this?
Well,
People seem to struggle.
You made a comment about the difference between improved and what you'd like to see in the future. And honestly, as I think about this, I kind of get stuck on improved. I go across that and I go over the list and say, oh. When I think about what I would do differently in the future, you know, I kind of like the character of the neighborhood that I'm in. It's why I chose to live in that neighborhood. I don't have really a problem that
Your answer would be no.
right there.
Well, they've done.
But what do you like about it?
I like the kind of both consistency and how the homes are built and how everything's just a little bit different. I like that we have neighborhoods that have fairly good separation between homes. But still, within our neighborhood, we can walk and everyone knows everyone down the street. It's not a dense neighborhood. I mean, it's big RS7, but we have some of that same kind of feel as a closer neighborhood. I love the fact that I can get on my bike, or if I feel a little bit more ambitious, I can walk 4 blocks that way or 5 blocks that way and get to just about anything that I need.
So looking at these, I mean, with that answer, looking at these, did you think something was missing that you felt?
There's a part of me that, you know, as a citizen in the community that understands the struggles we have in wanting to get at density. I mean, I can go that direction with, well, we could turn on ADUs and maybe enable that in our neighborhood. That would be a benefit to the overall community. It isn't though something that when I think about my neighborhood and what I want, I would want that because I'm a citizen of Lawrence, not because I'm a member of this neighborhood.
That question's 5.
Okay.
We'll get to that question. I just wondered.
You have a homeowners association?
I do.
There's an issue right there about whether you can ever do ADUs or anything else.
Yeah, but HOA covenants can change. We're changing ours right now to enable things like, as a matter of fact, ADUs is one of the conversations.
That's good.
Okay, well, what characteristics or neighborhood area do you, of your neighborhood or area, do you hope are preserved as new residential development occurs over time? School could go there, I guess. Is this one, I mean, to me, I was thinking this is very similar to 2. But Elizabeth, what were you trying to get at there that was different? Maybe I jumped the gun here. I should let someone answer.
It's the housing is the big piece of this. It is, in theory, a gentle question to prompt, hey, new residential housing has to happen. If it happens, what is important that you guys want to hold on to? And hopefully the answer is not new residential housing. So if there's a better way to frame this question, let's think about that. But we were wanting to see what people, if we asked people to think about new residential development, what their next few thoughts would be.
Well, I think you need to lead with that.
Okay.
If new residential development occurs in your neighborhood, what characteristics would you hope be preserved?
Would it be reasonable to expand it to just development? Because, part of Plan 2040 is trying to add neighborhood commercial.
Yeah.
So if that's something that causes concern as well, I mean.
New development, that's a good.
Yeah. I mean, even to a certain extent, like very light, small scale industrial, like an automotive shop, right? I mean, all sorts of different classes could occur depending on how we loosen it up.
I first read that and thought it was pretty similar to 2, but now I see what they're saying, that you focus on the residential. So I think you need to lead with that.
Okay.
Or how do you see new residential development being added to your neighborhood? I mean, we could just,
That's 5.
That's actually 5, yeah.
oh, well, then why is it?
Is there a parallel
This one-
question?
I think I would almost switch those then.
Right.
to say,
Lead with,
lead with, how could new residential development be accommodated? And then what would you like to keep as that happens?
yeah.
Are we also adding the inverse question about moving non-residential or mixed use into neighborhoods?
Yes.
I think we should. I could see leaving them two different questions.
Or you could just say development and leave it wide open, and then each person in each neighborhood could probably interpret as they see is gonna happen. Like if you're in East Lawrence, you're probably much more likely to anticipate some small commercial. But if you're in like, I'm trying to think of a far west neighborhood, like the Langston East neighborhood, not likely that you're gonna start seeing like a dry cleaner on your street, right? So, I mean, as long as we can trust that people will interpret it in the context of their own neighborhoods. Maybe leaving it broad is good enough.
Interpret it in the context of housing, quite honestly. Because
I think most will.
Well, but I think our question is, how do we accommodate more housing? So I think housing has to be part of the question, and then and other defining characteristics, you would say in East Lawrence, we want a mixed neighborhood. We want some, we want to accommodate this commercial and shopping, as long as they have more than 4 parking spaces.
Say, Gary, I'll put you back on the spot. How would you answer 4 and 5? How can new residential?
So I just got stuck on something that Marcy just said about, I'm going to paraphrase, what I heard you say was, the goal of this is to get at more housing. Is that the goal of this, to get at more housing? Because that's not what we're saying. We're asking to qualify, describe the characteristic of your neighborhood, not with that purpose in mind. And if the idea is to do that, then let's get at that up front, as opposed to hoping that we kind of get at it quietly. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, but this, I think number 5 says, how could new residential development be accommodated?
For the purpose of more housing. I mean, if that's what we're really trying to get at, then let's go at it.
That's fine.
Well, and that was that's where I started with. Are we talking about infill in this whole conversation?
If you're saying, what can we do in my
I don't
neighborhood
see the application
to improve an increased density?
exercise.
I can come up with a whole bunch of different things. It doesn't, but it will change the character of the neighborhood.
Well, I guess I could see if we create kind of the area that's like, East Lawrence or Oya neighborhood with alleys and, this, that, and the other. And we have those defining characteristics. And then you have some defining characteristics of West Lawrence. You could have a developer come in and say, I want to build a neighborhood with no driveways and with alleys, and I want that in my neighborhood. And so we could say, hey, let's use these standards over here in that new greenfield development.
Well, that was Briarwood, right?
But.
So then you have.
So do we have this catalog? I bring in a development and, okay, I want that, and I want that, and, is that, I just,
I think one of the concerns I think we're trying to get here, and Elizabeth or Jeff, is that we can correct me, is our development code now has some rules that work really well in this neighborhood, but when you try to apply it to that neighborhood, it doesn't work very well.
but again, that is infill.
Yeah. But it also limits, I think, new developments, because someone comes in and says, I want 3-foot setbacks. Our code says, well, in a new development, you can't have 3-foot setbacks. You have to have 5-foot setbacks. But we could say, well, but if you're doing something with garages in the back and alleys, then hey, you have 3-foot setbacks. So yeah, I do think you see that. That was what I've imagined.
Yeah, I'm just trying to picture application, and I'm just,
So if I may, based on what you're saying is like, all right, so we're asking people in existing neighborhoods, what do you like about your neighborhoods? Which I'm assuming if you could extrapolate that, would say, what do people in Lawrence like about their part of Lawrence? And if they were to move to a further out part of Lawrence, would they still like that? That's probably what they'd be looking for. maybe unless they're
Why would
escaping.
they move out there if they're still looking for that? I mean,
Unless they're escaping their neighborhood, right? But generally speaking, I feel like, it is going to be an exercise in extrapolation because obviously nobody lives in the neighborhoods that aren't built yet, so you can't really do much about it. That being said, I think what Elizabeth said early on when we were talking about the code review, code assessment, was that there is a possibility of dividing neighborhood types into things like historic, pre-war suburbs, post-war suburbs, Reagan era suburbs, stuff like that. And then, having a slightly different approach to each one of those instead of being so rigid, like this was RS7, this is RS5. And then, if we can see, okay, based on our survey results, the people in the historic neighborhoods like this kind of thing, the people in the 90s and 2000 suburbs like this sort of thing. So, you might end up with like 3 different toolkits that perhaps the developer could select from as they're going out and say like, I'm feeling that the market is thinking Briarwood, or like, I'm thinking more of a Langston Hughes neighborhood, right? And maybe that's where the information we generate here can be used to develop those kind of, I don't want to say parallel codes because they're not going to be, but different toolkits.
yeah, and I have full appreciation for that, but okay, I like neighborhoods with mature trees, but I tell you what, it's kind of hard to do that in a new neighborhood. I like a neighborhood full of 1950s, 1960s architecture. I could probably kind of pull that off, but not very well.
Yeah.
I like neighborhoods that are walkable. Okay, that's something that every neighborhood is going to have because that's pretty mandated. Or are you going to give me the option to not put any sidewalks in the neighborhood? And okay, I'm going to design a neighborhood that is not walkable.
But walkability is a lot more than sidewalks.
In an old neighborhood.
I'm 100% with you, so I'm just, I don't want to rain on this parade. I mean, I'm kind of enjoying it. In full disclosure, I live in the county. So my neighborhood, my nearest house is 1,000 feet away, and everybody owns cows and tractors and it's really walkable, but you got to have mud boots.
This is why I haven't called on you.
Yeah, I know. But I think I'm getting something out of this, and I'm working on it, but I'm clearly taking it, trying to think from the application. So don't think I'm kind of beating it up. I'm just trying to.
I think you're looking ahead, which is important. I mean,
Yeah.
you're basically trying to tie this to what's going to come, and I think that makes sense. And I think some of these characteristics are not going to be applicable to stuff like you're saying, mature street trees. Who cares, right? Historic resources. What are you going to do? But the dimensional things, I think, if people are able to think in that way, which will be interesting to see if they can, that's what I think is going to be important.
Yeah.
To go back to the first comment about, if the goal is really to get at infill density, if that's how to create more housing, then maybe we set that as a context up front. You don't have to change every question, but.
But I think it's both. I think it is both. I think it's to understand what type of, like I said, you've seen in communities where people are trying to create a new downtown, a new, they're putting in.
Yeah.
They're putting in a street, and then they're putting in townhomes, and then they're putting in, they're creating a neighborhood where they're trying to recreate downtowns. I mean, around the city, there are these 15-minute walkable neighborhood things. Our codes really, would have a hard time doing that in a greenfield setting now. And so again, I think by creating what these, not parallel codes, but getting some of these things, I think gives us that flexibility, not just in infill. So I think if you say that, we've limited it.
So,
But new housing isn't just infill. I mean, I think.
No, I said both. That's what I'm saying, both.
Right, I mean, I think that what we're asking is what people want in terms of housing, but is the idea that Lawrence wants to have more housing, and then how do we approach that? I mean, and then I think we need to say that up front rather than like your neighborhood, you want a school,
Like the purpose of the development code update.
right.
Well, we can put that in. I mean, we have a purpose statement for the development code update.
it's basically in here. So while I agree with that's the logic progression of what we as the steering committee and as the consultants in the city are trying to do, like, we know we got to get here. How are we going to get here? Let's go over some of what people like and what the objections are. I feel like from a layman's point of view, from somebody who's never cracked open the zoning code, it seems like it may be better to butter them up a little bit and say, like, what do you like? What's your favorite thing? And you like the brick sidewalks, like the trees, that every house looks the exact same. What's your sort of thing, right? And then get them to start thinking about, well, what could be a little bit better? What are you okay with compromising on? what do you really, really hope never changes? And then it gets people to define up front what the character is when they inevitably will say, but it's against the character of the community, because everybody thinks about that differently, right? So if you get people to be honest about their thinking up front, then maybe by question 5, you're like, all right, so really what we're talking about here is housing, right? We've talked about what you like and what you don't like. Now that you put that on paper, let's see what, when the rubber meets the road, right? If we say, we are going to have to add some maybe lot splits or break some single families into duplexes, right? Like there'll have to be some way to add new housing. But okay, now that I've seen what I care about the most, well, it turns out I didn't really care about the density of the housing. I care about the trees after all. So it might help people have sort of an honesty check. Like I said, if we butter them up first. But Elizabeth, that may be something more in your expertise because you've done a lot of public meetings with people who maybe don't know about zoning codes. So is that the strategy?
That is it. The strategy is that housing is an important thing we need to understand, but the other aspects of character still will play into the regulations. We can't skip the street tree and the sidewalk thing. That all matters. It matters for infill, but it also matters, if someone wants to build a new neighborhood that is more of a, traditional urban neighborhood, whereas before they might have wanted to do a 1980s or 90s subdivision. So we want to make sure that we have those standards in place. And then actually to where we were a little bit ago, if we're going to retrofit commercial into existing neighborhoods, or if we're going to be able to build neighborhoods that have commercial in them, the character matters for that type of development also. It matters that we get stuff that fits. So we're thinking in terms of how structures go in and how neighborhoods are designed. And we do actually, there's a lot of truth to, we're bringing people to this in more of concepts that they understand. I don't know that we could sit down with every neighborhood and have a detailed design discussion. I'm guessing we could in some of the neighborhoods, but we're trying to meet people where they are and let them come into this process. So we want to get at housing, we want to get at commercial, we want to get at street trees, we want to get at rural development. We kind of are being greedy. We want to get at all of it and then sort it out and see what we hear. So what I'm hearing you guys say is between 4 and 5, where are we going and what are we doing? And I'm thinking, why don't we scratch out 4? 5 is the more direct question. And then add a question that is similar about how could new mixed use or commercial development be accommodated in your neighborhood and what characteristics need to stay.
I feel like if we get rid of number 4, then we're going to be missing collection of the data points of what are people going to hold on to, like cold dead hands, right? Like, what do you hope is preserved as your neighborhood changes? What's, as cities were built over millennia, change is the only thing that was constant until the advent of zoning post-World War II, right? So what do people really want to cling to? So like, don't touch these, right? It seems like that might be important as well for, but to make sure that we're not changing.
I think we build it into the rewritten questions. So we take 5 and then we add a characteristic part to it, but it leads with residential, like you guys are saying. So, how could new residential development be accommodated in your neighborhood? What characteristics are important to maintain? And then flip question, how could new commercial or mixed use be accommodated in your neighborhood and what characteristics are important to maintain? Do you think that was there?
Yep, that makes sense.
I like that too.
I do too.
So if you say in a word, what's the flavor, vibe, or type description of your neighborhood? I don't think that's the place to end. I think that's the place to start.
We could do that. Get people thinking.
Yeah, just sort of start what?
Icebreaker.
Yeah, it's an icebreaker. What's the flavor? And then you say, using the neighborhood qualities, what did you add from that?
But let me add, I was going to say, and I like that as question 1 too. I think question 2 should be, in a word, what's the flavor, vibe, or type of description of the neighborhood you'd like to live in? Because we have a lot of people who are not, they're living in the neighborhood, but they're not necessarily the neighborhood they want to live in. They might want to move.
Oh, okay.
And so they might say, I live in a suburban single family, but I want to live in an urban electric, eclectic. That's where I want to live. I'm not living there. Because that could give us it also could give us some insight on how they're answering these questions. Because if someone says, I live in a suburban district, I want to live in an urban district, well, then when they answer the question, what is important to preserve, it might be a different answer than someone who says, I live in a suburban district, and I want to live in a suburban district.
But what about then doing 7 is 1 and then 2 and then have another one? What's the vibe you want to live in and how could your neighborhood be improved?
Yeah.
So what I hear, the most common request I get is, do you have a house we could buy that's in, close to downtown, one level living?
Big yard.
Big
Walkable, right? And we have 3 and they're all sold. Right.
There are hardly any of them.
Right.
All priced below 200,000.
But again, one of the things I think that tells me back to the Springfield question, I mean, if the overwhelming answer is that people want to live in, neighborhoods, that are much more urban feeling, I think that's a good thing to know. I think it's a good thing to know. Because.
Yeah, what if we learn something out of this that is not popular right now? For example, our interviews are, everybody wants to live on a cul-de-sac. Right? And cul-de-sacs are not very popular in coming through the planning office right now, because they want to connect all the streets. If we're talking about what the homeowners want, we're not talking here about what the city prefers about connecting streets and about the utilities and all that other kind of stuff. But if we're talking about what the homeowners and the people in the neighborhoods want, we know that people love to live in a cul-de-sac, right? So how do you rectify that?
Well, it's a good question. Let's see what comes out. I think that's the important thing.
Draw a line in the middle of the city and half is cul-de-sacs and half is not. I mean, yeah, I don't want to live on a cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
I think if you're walking or you're biking, that's the worst thing.
But some people do.
Got little kids.
Right.
Live on a cul-de-sac.
Right. But I think.
I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old and they play out in the cul-de-sac every day.
No, I'm not saying, I think there's people that want to live in cul-de-sacs and people that don't.
I think some of it is that there's a publicly expressed want based on our lived experience, and that is that cul-de-sacs are safe, through streets are not. But then there's the reality based on the rest of the world, and that is that most of the world doesn't have cul-de-sacs. They have very safe streets that are, well, at least, Netherlands, Germany, France, whatever, very, very small streets where the cars don't go over 10 miles an hour because they physically cannot. Or there's no cars on them at all, so people can play in the streets, but still be able to access where they gotta go. So like a child can play on the streets in Tokyo, which, believe it or not, has a surprising amount of really slow streets and small walkable areas, but they're not cul-de-sacs, and somehow people still manage to play on the streets. So I think because Americans, we only know that the only safe place is like your own backyard and a cul-de-sac, it's hard for people to think about what else could be safe if that's what they truly want. Is it that you want a lack of access and throughput? Well, cul-de-sac it is. But if you want your kids to play safety, that's not the only way you can get there. So I'll be curious to see what other character things we start to suss out of here and see like what are people really asking for instead of just what they know already, right?
I don't think we're here, we can't change American culture. That's not what we're here to do,
When they wanted to widen Iowa Street, this is probably 30 years ago, I thought it would be cheaper to just get everybody a ticket to New York City and have them understand that the traffic isn't really bad here. I mean, so some of what. What?
It was 50 years ago.
Was it 50? It was, okay. You know what? Maybe 45? Was it 45? 45 years ago. They didn't want to widen Iowa, but so how do we give people experiences to help them realize how many different ways there are to live and what other opportunities are there?
I don't think we can, but I think the point of having these characteristics being broken down into a relatable way, I think will get us there. And I think that's sort of the goal of the exercise. I don't know if there is any better way to do it, honestly, like to truly drill down, like what is driving this,
But again, my vision, I do think eventually you could see, that you could have, you know, like you said, a suburban housing type and an an urban housing type and a historic housing type. And again, I think, part of the challenge of that is, when we're talking about Greenfield, I mean, again, do we say all of it's this, or do we say, hey, you can have that if you have this too, or what? I think that's where again, where the code goes. But I think we need to learn a little bit about that. That's what I'm interested in learning, but yeah.
I think we're all operating, the code has to have more flexibility in it than we have now. I mean, everybody, I think, agrees to that, no matter where you stand on any other issue. It's too rigid, so.
To go back over some of these things that we have, like building height. It says, building height is vertical distance. You might like that your neighborhood has all similar building heights. The only thing I've ever heard about building heights is that people don't want to feel like somebody is looking down on their backyard. I mean,
Or casting a shadow over it.
okay, yeah, it's either casting a shadow or I don't want somebody in an apartment. I don't want to go in my backyard and always feel like somebody's looking at me from.
Over my privacy.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know that the building height question is asking what the concern is for people being mixed in terms of building height.
It sounds like you interpreted that almost immediately of like height. Okay, I don't like that particular part. I have a feeling other people might interpret it that way as well. Whereas I'd look at it more from like a wonky standpoint. I think these are a little bit open-ended, and depending on your experiences and your values, you may approach it a slightly different way.
I think that's what the goal here is, looking for what common values there are across all the areas of the city and where we have a lot of divergence in that.
But this focuses on a mix of heights that gives it a variety of looks. That's not what people are reacting to when they talk about, either.
Well, but that's not the only part of this. I mean, it also says you might like that your neighborhood area has all similar building heights that contribute to a uniform look. So I think that could be answered to get into, I like that I live in an urban neighborhood that has taller buildings and more density, not necessarily saying what you're talking about is there's a mix that is offensive in some way.
Well, but I don't think anybody's talking about building height about how it looks to you. I don't think I like my neighborhood is because it's building heights. I think I like the feel that, I know my neighbors and they're like me, or I'm in an urban area and it's built up. But I'm just sort of saying is the building heights, we like it or we don't like it, doesn't seem to be what it looks like. Building seems like how it works, or, if you're in a lot of density, you like it because you're close to restaurants.
Well, building height's been a big point of discussion when we're talking about development downtown. There's a push to density and there's obviously more building height, but there's been a lot of discussion about what is too tall for downtown, or how far do we want to take building height? So, I think it's a relevant consideration. It's not going to apply to every neighborhood.
How I interpreted building heights as it comes to character in neighborhoods, for example, if you're in the older Prairie Meadows neighborhood and they're all ranchers, and somebody did a tear down and came back in and put a great big 2.5-story, West Lawrence type house in there, that really would be out of character, that whole neighborhood, where all the rest of the houses are not even close to that. So do you want to protect from that or not? I don't know, but I would interpret that as being partially a height issue.
If you're on 18th and Tennessee and you tear down a single house and you put up a 2-story building, 2-story condo sort of looking thing, do you like that? 3 stories, do you like that? Or do you not like it?
Yeah.
That's where character of the neighborhood, how do you use the character of the neighborhood to?
I think the other thing, Elizabeth mentioned this earlier, I think lots of times when you see they're asking you to click through pictures. Do you like this or do you like that? And height becomes a bigger part of that. Here, I agree with you mostly, it's a little harder to think people will use it too much on the pencil and paper, but if they do, I think it'll be telling.
And I mean, what might be telling is its absence as well. If it turns out people don't really care that much, that could be an interesting data point too.
Sure.
You know, if it's all about density but not really height, like, I don't really care.
Until it's proposed next to them.
Of course,
Right.
yeah, I love apartment buildings there.
I'm gonna jump in for a second. I agree with everything you guys are saying. From our perspective, we also hear it as a proxy for fear of change. And so we'll have people say, well, we can't put XYZ thing there because the building's going to be too tall. And so sometimes it means that they can't articulate what it is they don't like about XYZ thing, but it comes in the form of height. And so that's one of the reasons we test for that. So there's a lot hidden in this particular question here. And I'm curious to see what's going to come through on it.
So why don't you ask the question, what height would be too tall? What height in your neighborhood would be too tall? Instead of, do you like a variety of heights or a single height? I think the question is, how tall is too tall? And you know, it used to be just the height was on the basis of you didn't have to have an elevator, you know, and the building code and
Still is, yeah.
fire code, yeah.
But again, we're not asking the question if you like height, we're asking what 3 characteristics do you like the most and the 3 characteristics you like the least. It'll be interesting to see what should change. It'll be interesting to see if anyone selects that or how they select that.
And as question 4 is currently written, what do you hope is preserved as new residential development? Sounds like height would be a top hot button issue for a lot of people. So like, that's the kind of data that would be collected in the current question 4, it's going to be changed, but.
I'd be
I think somebody
surprised
would
if-
say, I like I guess a rancher. Go ahead.
I'd be surprised if many people, given the way that's framed, would say, I really want taller buildings.
Right, exactly. I think most people say really don't want taller buildings.
But if we're talking about how to build more housing density, infill capability, if the question is framed in that context, building height might come to the top of the list. Yeah, I'd take an extra story across this area to get at 25% more density.
And yeah, well, you choose, setback or separation or height.
Yeah,
What do you care more about?
But to that idea, but what we're trying to get at, because if it's just character of the neighborhood, no, I don't want a taller building. No, I don't want that. But what's an easier way? What are the best ways to maintain a character, but also allow for that? Would you be comfortable with? Would you accept another story?
Would you agree that that's what question 5 kind of asks? Like, all right, if we got more housing, are you okay with height?
Yeah, it might kind of ask, but that's the thing, right? It goes back to the way I was answering this question. I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here, but it's back to the way I thought about those questions. I'm thinking about my neighborhood and what do I like about that neighborhood? What do I want to change in the neighborhood? Well, I don't want to change anything in the neighborhood. But if the question is, what could we change in this neighborhood that would be a part of this larger goal that we have in our community, how as we develop and redevelop in our neighborhood, if these are our goals, what are some ways you could get at that? Well, we've got 7 lots just down the street. We've been working with the developer in a specific way. If I think about it in that other context, I'm going to talk to the developer about some different things. Maybe not exactly like the character of our neighborhood, but maybe something a little bit different. But maybe it'd be more open to
If the question is,
family.
if the question is something like, if new residential development is occurring in your neighborhood, how could it be accommodated? I mean, isn't that direct enough?
Yeah, but again, if what we're really trying to get at is more housing availability, not just more housing, but density and infill. If it's just more housing, then maybe you don't need to say that. But if it really is about more density, if it's really about greater capacity within the square, miles that we have inside of our city, I'm not sure we're going to get at that.
I mean, you're saying how new residential development can be accommodated in your neighborhood is not direct enough? I guess I'm missing. What do you think we should say that's, how can new residential development be accommodated in your neighborhood? That seems pretty direct to me.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Like on Tomahawk Ridge, it's fill out the lots, right? In East Lawrence, it's like, well, you could probably add some ADUs. And in other spots, it's, you know, you could increase the occupancy limit.
So the simple answer in my neighborhood would be, well, yeah, build 5 more houses like all the rest of them. And that would get to it, right? It'd maintain the character of the neighborhood. I feel like, though, it's missing the larger point. Maybe I'm overthinking it. It could be as simple as that.
I hear what you're saying. I'm just not sure how you can ask that question, Dean, where you at?
And I go back to the question about height, right? If we're not really asking the height question in a context, I'm not sure that we're going to get an answer other than I like it the way it is.
What if we add a prompt to the question? And I think we said, what if we added a parens that said height, setback, lot size, or housing structure type? And could explain, duplex, triplex. So we get them thinking beyond 5 more houses just like mine. The other place of this, though, is once we get the survey out and get the drafts going, we will make some of these changes in the draft regulations, and then we'll ask for feedback to those specific changes. So sometimes it's challenging to ask people to conceive of what could be different because they don't do zoning all the time. Yeah. And when we put the draft out in front of them and we say, hey, we're recommending that you guys go up an entire story in this neighborhood, then we'll get the, yeah, we can live with it, or over my dead body comment. So we will get a couple bites at this particular apple.
I do think it would be really pretty helpful to do as you just described and provide a couple of examples, because like it was easy for me to just list like 10 things I would immediately change. Like that this would easily free up a lot of space and a lot of land that's already technically built out. But I think, if you've only ever lived in a single family suburban development, all you would probably conceive of is like, how do you add new houses? You buy a new farm, you bulldoze it, and you add exactly what my neighborhood looks like, just do it again. Or you tear down my neighbor's building and you make it into an apartment building, 10 stories high, right? Like that's the unfounded fear of a lot of folks worried about change, right? It's like, those are kind of the only, commonly thought of ways to add more housing, right? So these are more tricky ones that unless you know what places used to look like and how they used to build before zoning, it's hard to even conceive of that.
Yeah, I think the prompts are helpful, height, setback, ADUs, I think those are.
Yeah.
Under housing types, I'd like to add townhouses to just single family, duplex, or multifamily. I think townhouses is a sort of different sort of thing, and multifamily just sounds like.
It suggests a thing.
Yeah, it suggests a different thing, and I think townhouses are a more interesting thing to add.
Marcy, do you mean like row homes?
Yeah, row homes.
Okay.
Or row houses, we could say row houses or townhouses. And then I want to know what neighborhood pools are. This is under landscaping.
Wow.
We don't have it.
I know, we don't have neighborhood pools, but it's in here. It says, do larger lots, lawns, and neighborhood pools.
We have lots of, we have several neighborhoods that have a neighborhood pool.
Yeah.
Out west, that you have a neighborhood,
Well, so, but I think, the neighborhood pool seems to be in the wrong place. It should be, do larger lots, lawns define your neighborhood, or informal or community parks and pools. I think the pools belong with the community park because it's kind of a shared resource rather than a individual resource. Does that make sense?
I hear what you're saying. I do think that makes more sense than lumping it in with larger lots.
Right, because I think a larger lot is it my individual space?
I think what they might be trying to get at is the character of a neighborhood that might have a shared pool also has large lots.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
So should I tell you how we're going to increase housing in East Lawrence that I think I've come up with? We have a community garden, and I think it's possible to have the community garden along the alley. And so build a tenants to homeowners house on the lot that's the community garden, but have garden space, the same number of garden spaces along that alley. And I think it would be really fun to drive down there and see those gardens.
Go for it.
Afternoon sun,
What?
just afternoon sun.
It's actually better sun because they built a big house next door, so we've lost
Already got, I know. Shade.
the shade, so.
Okay, what else am I missing? I do like the last one. I thought, for learners of all ages, draw you your favorite things about your home or neighborhood. That's interesting. I want to see Nick's drawing.
Terrible. Sticks and triangles. I did have a few suggestions on, we talked a lot about either separating or consolidating some of these characteristics. I feel like proximity to parks and open space and landscaping and open space are almost close enough that you could probably combine them if you feel that we're getting too heavy on the characteristics. One's like, do you have it, do you like it? And the other one is, can you get to it? Presumably, if it's in your neighborhood, you can probably get to it. There's not a lot of gigantic neighborhoods. Hickney is very large geographically, but still. I also think building setback and separation are fairly close. Like when I was reading setback, I thought, what about like the rears and along the side? And then I read the next one. Oh, there it is. Side setbacks is building separation. So, it's like how we're building separated from each other and from the street. Also, because setback's kind of a zoning word.
What do you think about adding some different descriptors under 7? The flavor, vibe, and type of your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Those seem fairly clinical, fairly academic descriptions. Well, okay, I guess I'm suburban, single family.
What do you think a planner about those? Me, maybe?
When I think about the word flavor or vibe, things I wrote down are like my neighborhood. I'm in a neighborhood. My neighborhood's a neighborhood, and I have neighbors. My neighborhood's complete. My neighborhood's walkable. My neighborhood's private. My neighborhood's vibrant. Something draw them into some descriptions other than the.
Or maybe not even provide any.
I guess,
Yeah.
Gary, from a data collection standpoint, what does that tell us if somebody calls their neighborhood vibrant or?
Probably not much from the standpoint of how, and I would also move that farther forward in the survey, from the standpoint of how it might draw people in to think about the answers to the questions that they're asking. What do they like about it now? What would they like to see it be? I think it opens up the way people actually think about their neighborhood as opposed to a data collection exercise.
Gary, how about,
Icebreaker.
yeah, Gary, how about if your neighborhood was a dog?
What kind of dog would it be?
I just use that in the staff survey. I love it.
It would be a lot of fun, actually.
One person describing their neighborhood as vibrant, somebody else would look at the same neighborhood and say it's dull as dirt. Loud. It's mini Disneyland.
No, and I suspect you're right, but I think I'll probably say that from just about any two people that might look at something and how it reflects through their values. All I'm suggesting, I'm not locked in on those words. I just use them as examples of something that's not necessarily indexable, but it draws people into more of a feeling about where they live and where they would like to be and what it might be.
Well, I think if you, I hear what you're saying there. Again, I don't know how many questions we can ask, but I do think, again, from a data point of view, to me, it'd be helpful to say, how do you describe your neighborhood and use these clinical definitions? And what kind of neighborhood would you like to live in case that's different? But maybe you start out with, that's a whole lot different than flavor, vibe, or hype, and just leave that open-ended. Because that is a different question, I think. That's a different question. I think I could get people talking.
When I start with that, and then I start thinking about, well, what would I want different in my neighborhood? All of a sudden,
Yeah.
it opens me up to some other things, and that takes me then back to this list of things, which in my view, I said it earlier on, some of this stuff I think is fairly restrictive. I'd like to see it opened up a little bit less quarter mile, a little bit less, my version of proximity to services is different than someone else's. My version of building height might be, and the reasons for it might be different. Just like to see us open it up a little bit.
Other
We can-
thoughts? Oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was gonna say, we can either look at moving the clinical list around. I don't think we were gonna use that as much for data collection. I kind of like the idea of letting people come up with their own word. Or I could just, put this list out and add some other goods and bads to it, but it's just to get a flavor. So it might become a word cloud, or it might become something descriptive that we put in a report later. Some of the rest of this is where we're looking to go from a regulatory perspective. We might have we might take the characterize your neighborhood in one of these categories and just use that as a checkbox at the end or something along those lines. But they're not very vibey, I have to say. I agree with that.
No vibe or flavor there.
Nope. Very vanilla. Okay. Anything else, guys?
Play around with the characteristics and qualities, and I think they could be, maybe to me, the consistent architectural style should be right next to historic resources instead of sort of on a different page, so that I'm kind of thinking through a set of things.
Where would a characteristic, a quality like just the feeling of safety and security fall into any of these?
Love that.
Yeah.
Not really addressed, doesn't seem like.
So along the potential new ones, we have something to do with accessibility and mobility, a feeling of safety and security, maybe something on mixed use, defining infrastructure to signature features, adding students to the demographic mix, looking at combining landscaping and open space with proximity to parks or open space, and loosening up some of the specific walkability, distance-oriented things, and adding alleys to location of garages or parking access.
Good notes.
Not everybody has a garage.
True.
It says location of garages.
And/or parking.
Yeah.
Parking answers. Okay, other thoughts, comments? What do you think, Elizabeth, the timing of this? Like, when do you want to get it out in the process, and when do you think having it complete?
So a lot of the questions in this are relevant to our second drafting module. So the reason we asked you guys to look at it now is so we can go back and clean it up and get it up fairly quickly. So we are all working on module 1. We can give the community a month to 6 weeks. If you think that's enough time, that was one of the questions we wanted to ask you, to take this out and work on it. And then as we get closer to where we want to be in the module 2 development standards, midsummer, we can work this information back into it. So in your experience in the past, what's a good amount of time to leave something like this open?
Well, I mean, I think, how long do we do for the strategic plan, Jeff? If you remember, I think it was
4 to 6 weeks off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think 6 would be a lot if, once we're ready to launch it and launch it hard. That being said, I think if it trickles in after you're working on it, it can still influence maybe what we're thinking about. But yeah, I think 6 weeks would be plenty. I mean,
Summer's not going to be a good time for students or to get any input.
No, and be open to extend it when you get the public outcry. We're just finding out about it.
Yeah. So for students, I mean, with you guys' input, I'm hoping that we could get this in shape in a couple of weeks and get it up and out. So we could catch them before finals, but probably they're not going to be so focused on doing planning surveys for us. So let's get it up and going, and then talk about how we want to bring them in. I agree. We'll put an end date on it, but that doesn't mean we can't reopen it at like a student-oriented version of it, and reach out to both schools and say, hey, do you guys have any classes that want to work on this? So it's information that we can refine as we go. We're not done until we get to a month before adoption. So we give everyone a time to read it. And then, it still should be a living document. So we'll have some time across the summer and into the fall to make sure that we've given everyone an opportunity to say their bit.
Also give them time to get it out to high schools, middle schools, elementary schools that want to participate, because we've had a lot of participation in the downtown plan and with some other work. So this gives them an opportunity for them to chime in too.
Sounds
Yeah.
good.
To Jim's point, once you release section 2, people will be wanting to take the survey saying, where did this come from?
I mean, I'm just using the example of, updating the county wind energy code. And it's amazing how many people say, after it's been going on for 2 years, there are people that still don't know about it. You have to give us more time, which we are, but.
Yeah, so
We wanted to push this along because we want this to
We already had neighborhood plan. How many years? And then suddenly the first meeting it comes to the city commission. We never knew about it.
I knew.
Yes,
yeah,
from experience. Okay, if there's no more comments, Elizabeth, anything else you need from us?
I think in good shape. I really appreciate you guys taking your time to work through this and give us the feedback. We'll go ahead and get it cleaned up and going. We'll get the draft finished up and over to staff, and we will see you in late April, and we'll start working through districts and uses. One of our conversations at the beginning of our next meeting, and you'll have the draft before the meeting, is how do we want to proceed through this? So I don't feel like we're going to rush you. We want to ask the committee what their preference is. I expect it to be probably about 125 to 150 pages worth of zoning code, but it'll be the groovy stuff with pictures in it. So just know that we're not going to come in, slam it down and say we're going through it right now. We're going to have a discussion about how we'll do this as a group.
Perfect. Okay. Anything else for the good of the order? Appreciate it. Thank you all. Thanks, Elizabeth.